Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Peter Alilunas, Assistant Professor of Media Studies in the UO School of Journalism and Communications. He's also a faculty member in the Cinema Studies program. Alilunas earned a BA in English at the UO in 2006. He went on to earn a PhD in Screen Arts and Cultures from the University of Michigan. His first book, Smutty Little Movies, The Creation and Regulation of Adult Video, was published in 2016 with the assistance from the Oregon Humanities Center. Peter, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
What led you to make pornography a focus of your research?
Started in graduate school at the University of Michigan. My first year I was hired to be a research assistant by Dan Herbert, professor there, who was writing a book about American video store culture as it still exists. And he said, I want you to read everything ever written about home video to start. So in that process, I realized pretty quickly, where's the stuff on pornography? I had worked at video stores in the 90s, including Silver Star Video here in Eugene, which is long gone now. And we made a lot of money in that back room. And so I went back to Professor Herbert and said, where's the stuff on adult video? And he said, well, there just isn't anything on that. And that's a moment for any graduate student when you say, that's my topic. So I naively then said, well, I think I'm going to write the history of adult video. What ultimately happened is I wrote some history about adult video. Yeah.
Why is that research that needs to be done?
First and foremost, it's because there just isn't anything on it. And as a historian, when you see a gap that large, it starts to loom immensely. So the first reason is just simply because there isn't any work really on that subject. The second is that added layer of pornography. So we already have a challenge as historians bringing anything related to that topic to the surface. So it was sort of a double whammy. Video is kind of a neglected object anyway, and then putting pornography on there too meant that it was really neglected.
So say a little bit more about the sort of complications of choosing to study pornography. So you talk in your book about the good-bad dichotomy. What have you discovered about the relationship of quality good and porno and bad? Tell us about those problems and how they impact the problem of being a researcher.
Yeah, I think that what it boils down to is that culture tries to find ways to justify certain types of creative work. And one of the ways that that happens is by relabeling it. So some things are art and some things are not. Some things are erotica and some things are pornography. And when things are erotica, they are sort of justified as objects of study, as objects of pleasure, objects for the archive or for the museum or the library. And what I was really interested in was the stuff that was not that, the stuff that was really sort of the garbage. Garbage made a lot of money, and also made a lot of people happy. And those two things made me feel like it was just worthy of study. So in addition to kind of historicizing this object, I also tried to figure out why it isn't historicized typically. And that was sort of the reason that I came up with, was this good-bad idea, and why the good and bad has existed for centuries and probably will continue to persist.
So I know that a good portion of previous scholarship on pornography is concerned with questions of content and representation, how women get represented, but that's not what you do. Somebody who reads your book, there's no stills from porno movies in your book. You focused on industrial and contextual issues. So why? Why that? Why did you choose to go that way?
Well, first of all, I should say that those topics and questions are completely valid, necessary, and important, and there are a lot of great scholars doing that work. What I felt was that there was some other work that was not necessarily being done. So my training and expertise is in media industry histories, and I felt like that was a prime opportunity to do that on the adult video industry. It's not that I'm not interested in content or representation or ideology. In fact, those things are extremely important. What I want to do is sort of flip the lens and say, what industrial conditions lead to those things? What are the sort of materialist histories that we can uncover that haven't been looked at before? And then I like to put that into conversation with my colleagues who are doing other kinds of work too. But you're right, people who pick up my book are going to be surprised. It's really a lot less about content and a lot more about context, I like to say.
So let's start where you sort of begin your story. So what was the golden age of adult film? And I know that you're interested in the transition from that, but tell about that first of all.
Sure.
What was that?
Yeah, so what's called the golden age of adult film started in around 1971, 1972, and it's that moment when feature-length adult films started to play in public movie theaters. Prior to that point, there were sort of storefront theaters that played short films, or there were peep show booths. But right around the time of a couple films, Boys in the Sand and Deep Throat, we had an explosion of feature-length pornography that played in movie theaters. So for about 5 or 6 years, you had a movement where it became sort of chic, and people it was trendy, and people enjoyed going to the theater. And most importantly, it was the object of media fascination. So big news stories, big public discourse, a lot of buzz. Johnny Carson talking about Deep Throat. Linda Lovelace was a cultural icon for a while. That moment has kind of taken up all the airspace in pornography history because it was sort of the buzziest. But it was very short-lived. By the end of the 1970s, early 1980s, it kind of flamed out.
So why did it flame out? What were the factors that led to its demise?
Couple reasons, and all related to regulation. So moral regulation, pickets, the feminist movement, anti-pornography movements, religious movements, lots of cultural consternation about pornography and its content. And then there were legal regulations, so zoning laws, obscenity laws, lots of consternation from that angle, both working together to try to squeeze those movies back out of the movie theaters again. That's kind of the short version.
So into that circumstance, into those conditions, the Betamax is invented.
Yeah.
So tell us how video technology changes the pornography industry.
It's really exciting to imagine in late 1975, see, I just get excited as a historian, but in late 1975, if you said, here is a device that can play movies in your home, for a lot of Americans who could afford that technology in that moment, that was a real game changer. So this device in the holidays of 1975 changed everything, especially for pornography, because all that consternation about that public movie theater could now shift away into the private space of people's homes. It took a few years, but eventually all that public success moved into the home, is the kind of what happened.
So tell us about how that is affecting the home video industry. So what starts happening there?
Yeah, so late 1975, the Betamax is released. Almost immediately, people start experimenting with the technology. By, say, 1977, some adult video producers are shooting directly onto tape. In the meantime, all these adult film libraries are being transferred to magnetic tape and released on that format. So huge amounts of content's dumped onto the market. At the same time, Hollywood is very reluctant to use this new technology. So the initial years of home video were totally dominated by pornography. That trail was blazed by adult content.
And I know that you might expect that things go into the private home, that people wouldn't worry about it. But what happens around questions of moral regulation and legal regulation when this happens?
Lots of panic. And the panic is related to people's fear of the unknown. When things disappear again, then that feeling of anxiety rises because we're just not sure what's happening. So the epicenters of the panic became the visible sites. So for example, video store policies became a big deal. Video store layouts and geographies. Where are the adult tapes actually going to go? The ubiquitous back room was invented as a way of sealing off the toxic content from the rest of the material in the store. In the book, I talk about all these legal cases where video store owners were prosecuted for obscenity and the outcomes of those cases. And it was really an attempt to morally regulate people's behavior, even when that behavior was private.
And they also started to learn, well, let me put it this way. Talk about some of the larger cultural implications of this, some of the things that became clear as a result of these changes.
What, do you mean specifically the content of the tapes or people's behavior?
I'm thinking more about questions of gender around this. So, for example, you have this fascinating information that's released from the adult video industry journal about who's consuming these.
Yeah, I think what surprised people at the time in the 80s and also continues to surprise people is that pornography is not rented, purchased, and used by perverted men in raincoats. I think that's a cultural stereotype that continues to persist. There's a legendary poll that you're referring to in the Adult Video News Journal that almost half of adult tapes in the mid-1980s were rented by women. And that was a shockwave through the industry. Naturally, in capitalism, what happens when you discover a market is you want to fulfill that market. So suddenly, all kinds of new products were created that were aimed at women and couples. And we can talk about the implications of that, but it's exciting in the sense that maybe for the first time, pornography was made for alternate audiences than just perverts in raincoats.
So say a little bit about how these kinds of changes impact. I'm especially interested in the sort of divide between anti-pornography feminists and pro-pornography feminists, and so say a little bit about that divide and how that gets played out here.
This got really important in the 1980s, and it got important in part because of pornography production. So the the anti-pornography feminist movement in the 1970s, which rose up in places like New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, made pornography its target, but it also had other structural goals in culture. And the counter movement against that came in part because of alliances with pornography performers, such as Candida Royale, who was a performer in the 1970s during the golden age and then went and founded her own adult video production company. She got aligned with other pro-pornography feminists, and then all of them kind of rose up and made a sort of counter movement. And so today you still see vestiges of this in the tension between the two movements. And now you have pornography manufacturers who consider themselves feminists, and you have feminist movements that are opposed to these very same women. So that tension still continues to exist today, and I don't think it's necessarily dissipated. I do think what's different now, though, is that the movement of pornography producers that claim feminism is much louder and much more active than it used to be.
So these are the kinds of questions, the kinds of materials you study. How do you research this? What did you do? What did you look at?
That is an excellent question, and I have to give some credit here to my training at the University of Michigan. Richard Abel, a professor there, is one of the world's experts on French film history, and taking his classes was a master class in historiography, and he inspired in me the passion for that kind of research. I don't think he was ever expecting me to come to him in his office and say, I want to apply this to adult video history. I think that surprised him, being this silent French film historian, but he saw the value of what I was trying to do. Now that said, this involves what I call in the book trace historiography, which is trying to figure out a past when there are no more pieces of evidence left. How do you construct a picture of something when all you have left is, say, the smoke and not the fire? Pornography is so complicated anyway that this kind of history it can feel like it's impossible. In my case, this involved a lot of visits to archives, newspapers, interviews, and then little pieces of trace evidence, putting pieces of a puzzle together to kind of reassemble a portrait that we can make inferences from. So some of the book is explicitly traditional historiography, and some of it is more this inferential type reassemblage. Yeah.
And also I get the sense that there's very little scholarly writing on what you're focused on. Is that the case?
That's right, yeah.
So how do you figure out if there's scholarly credibility to what you're doing? I mean, I can imagine people saying, oh my God, this is Drek. First of all, what you're interested in is Drek.
Yeah.
At best, it's Drek, and at worst, it's it's ethically problematic.
Yeah.
And there's nobody that's written about this. So how did you solve that problem?
Well, I want to answer that by telling you about a conversation I had with the University of California Press when I sat down to kind of negotiate the contract for the book. And I said, I'm going to warn you all in advance that I have a lot of footnotes. And they said, what do you mean you have a lot of footnotes? And I said, well, I think the last draft of my dissertation research was in the thousands. So the point is that I try to overwhelm the process with references. Every step of what I do is cataloged. Everything I do, I want it to be meticulous in the scholarly tradition so that critics can come to me and say, well, this is in the tradition of any other type of research. Yeah, I don't know how many hundreds of pages there are of notes in this book. I don't have it with me today, but it's substantial. Let's put it that way. Yeah, yeah.
I know that you talked about media industry studies, right? Media industry history. You have an essay where you make an argument about that both media industry history studies are thriving and growing, and also studies of pornography are thriving and growing. But you make this argument that you want to make sure that the intersections or the people that are working on both, that thrives. Yeah. Why is that important?
Yeah, this is really important to me. Over the course of my career, which isn't substantial yet, but I've been in academia now for 12 years, and it feels like pornography studies is thriving but in a separate space. And I really worry that that's going to continue instead of integrating in with other types of scholarship. So media industry studies where I have a foot and porn studies where I have a foot, I'm trying to bring those things together. We need to treat pornography like any other object, not like it's a separate object. So to me, it's just film history. Mm-hmm. It's not really adult film history. My book is in the tradition of other traditional conventional histories. And so in my work in the field with colleagues, I'm a member of both of those groups, and I speak to both on behalf of the other. So I would love to continue to bring those groups together and not continue to separate them.
So well, first of all, how's the book been received?
So far, extremely well. I'm very happy with the reaction that I've heard. Reviews are just now starting to be written. The main thing, I think you would agree that when we do research, we have a target audience in mind. And my sort of target audience was fellow researchers in this area, and I'm overjoyed to say that it seems to have made an impact on them and their work.
Because you are more concerned with these questions of context and industry, rather than questions of representation or content, do you feel that in a certain way, that your method sort of makes your work safe and it'll get a kind of scholarly credibility that, the porn studies that looks at content has more trouble with?
Yeah, I think that might be one of the strategies that I had in mind, was to try to think of a way to move the discussion past some of those elements. And I saw an opportunity where it hadn't been done before. Now that said, I'm a passionate advocate for supporting that other kind of work that you're describing. And I've certainly done some of that kind of work and will continue to do it. I have many great colleagues that focus on representations and images and content analysis. And I support all that stuff. But I think you're right. I do think I try to enter into some conversations that maybe haven't been entered into before by pornography historians. Mm-hmm. So that might be true. Yeah. Yeah. So
I'm an undergrad at the University of Oregon. I just signed up for one of your classes. Yeah. I go into the classroom. What happens in there? What do you do? How do you teach this stuff?
Well, most of my classes have nothing to do with pornography. Okay. Right now I'm teaching J201, Media and Society, and there are 450 students in that class. And it's a very traditional communications theory class. Now, occasionally I will use pornography as an example of something, and the students are surprised, let's say, that there is an expert on this subject. They find that endlessly humorous. I'm sure their parents do too. Now, that said, I do teach some classes on sexuality and media and pornography, and I go back to the training that I had at the University of Texas, where I was a master's student with the great Janet Steiger. And on the first day, she said, this was a pornography studies class, and she said, okay, I want everybody to just get all their giggling out right now. Let's just deal with it, and then let's get back to serious scholarship. And that's kind of how I treat it. Like, let's acknowledge that this is something we don't normally talk about, and then let's get back to our serious work.
So I know that you're engaged now on a large-scale digital archive project. Tell us about that.
I'm glad you asked me about this. I'm very passionate about the future of this field. And when I was doing this research and realizing how difficult and complicated it is to get access to materials, I was worried about those future graduate students who may not have the resources that I did at the University of Michigan. And so I started to daydream about an online digital space where the materials of adult film history could be collected. Not the films themselves or the images, but the stuff around the films. So all the ephemera, the contracts, the documents, the interviews, the advertising, all the material elements.
So, where is this stuff? Where are the contracts? Where are they?
Well, it's very complicated. It's everywhere, but it's nowhere. Mm-hmm. I like to think of it as a little bit like those car shows on TV where the old Corvette is in the barn. The stuff is in the barn. We just have to go find it. There are people everywhere who have this stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's on eBay, it's in people's attics, it's in people's garages. Lots of it's in Southern California. There are thousands of former performers who have the stuff. So I started talking to some of my colleagues and we started thinking about creating this space. So for about 2 years we've been building the Adult Film History Project, and you can go to the adultfilmhistoryproject.com and read more about this. And it's in the early planning stages, and it's going to take time because it's ambitious. But I'm committed to this taking time because eventually it will work. It just needs time, space, and support.
So how are you going to, I mean, are you like using the web to invite these people, all these people, these retired performers, to share the material? Or are you going and knocking on doors?
More of that, yeah. Our model has been something called the Lantern, which a colleague of mine named Eric Hoyt developed, where he built an online archive of very old movie industry trade journals. And it's immense. There are thousands of these things on the site now. I think he has well over 1 million pages. And he started out with just an idea too. So I've had many conversations with him, and we think that the strategy is to gather up our network of scholars around the world and slowly start to assemble these pieces from our own collections and then work outward. So what we're doing right now is very slowly scanning and digitizing pieces from people's collections. And then we're talking to some spaces such as the U of O Library and the Internet Archive about hosting the material. Now, there are some challenges here in terms of content and questions of who can access the material and how. And those are questions we also have to answer.
I was wondering about copyright or
copyright,
I mean, I assume some of these things people want you to pay them for.
Yeah, the old magazines and journals and trade journals is a tricky question, but we are working on that actively. Yeah.
So the book is recently come out. It's beginning to get reviews. Things are going well, but you're at a Research One university. You've got to keep researching. So, what are you working on now? What's your next project?
Well, first of all, I love research, and I love being at a Research One university. That is my passion, is doing the research. The next project is still in the formative stages, but I think I can kind of break it down like this. I'd like to look at the history of urban renewal in the United States and how that affected the pornography industry. So specifically in cities in North America, how material businesses that people visited were squeezed out, and how and by who during that process.
These are businesses that sold or were involved in the pornography industry.
Like adult bookstores, adult movie theaters, places related to sex trades. How were they affected by urban renewal policies and procedures inside cities in urban areas in North America from, say, 1950 to 1980? That's kind of my rough idea right now, and it'll be kind of a history of those incidents and events that happened.
And why is that the period?
Well, I just feel like that's a prime period of change in America. That's when moral regulation, cultural regulation, religious regulation, economic regulation kind of intersected in some interesting ways with pornography and obscenity law and some other things. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, you mentioned in passing, a lot of these people are in Southern California. What's the status of the pornography industry today? Is it bigger, stronger than it ever has been, or is it more concealed? Just give me a sense of that.
It's probably both.
Mm-hmm.
The pornography industry has been decimated by the internet and by income and revenue models that don't necessarily sustain for them. So the amount of quote-unquote free material online is a serious threat to that industry and its sustainability. So what you see now is two things. You see a traditional industry modeled on Hollywood with quote-unquote studios and performers and spaces and cameras. And then you see what we call an amateur industry, where average people upload self-generated content to the internet and either do or do not find ways to monetize it. And those two things are in tension. The future of the industry is probably something more experiential, where you pay for an experience with a performer in real time, whether or not that's virtual reality or webcam based or haptic technologies is unclear, but it'll be some combination of those things, I predict. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. But if it's not the VCR, I really don't know, to be honest.
I have to tell you that my dad got one of the first Betamaxes back then, back in 75 or whatever.
Yeah.
I guess my final question has to do with how has pornography been tied to new technologies throughout history? I mean, there's been this weird way that pornography has gone hand in hand with new technology.
Yeah, I think the reason for that is risk. The pornography industry has always existed on the fringe anyway, so there's simultaneously more and less to risk. So those entrepreneurs have sometimes been more willing to gamble on something that might have a high return. So for example, the Betamax, they had very little to lose because they had really nothing to offer, right? So I think at some points in history you've seen that industry take up opportunities because they're willing to gamble. Yeah.
Okay, well, that sounds like a good spot for us to end on gambling. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about this fascinating work that you do, and good luck with the archive and your next project.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. I'm Paul Pepis. I've been speaking with Peter Alilunas, an assistant professor of media studies in the UO School of Journalism and Communication and an affiliated faculty in the Cinema Studies program. An alumnus of the UO, Alilunas published his first book, Smutty Little Movies, The Creation and Regulation of Adult Video, in 2016. Thanks so much for watching.